everybody. I'm so excited that we have so many wonderful people here joining us for this wonderful event. It is very, very rare that a publisher has the unique opportunity to get to publish work from somebody with very specific knowledge like Michael Fitz has on the bears of Brooks Falls at Katmai National Park. And we're here this evening to talk to Mike and about his book, The Bears of Brooks Falls, but also to get the inside scoop of what it's like to do the work that he's been doing and looking at these wonderful bears that are there, the salmon, the ecology, the human impact on them, and I'm very excited. So I'm going to introduce Mike. He's a former National Park Service ranger at Katmai and several other national parks, and he has distinguished himself as an expert in the natural history and ecology of Brooks River, particularly the river's brown bears. He continues to share his love of national parks and nature everywhere on his blog, fitznaturalist.com, and through his work as a fellow for explore.org. And he lives here in northern Maine. We're so excited. I'm excited to have you here tonight, Mike, but we're so lucky to have somebody with your knowledge base here as well. So welcome. And for those of you that don't know, my name is Heidi Carter from Bogan Books in Fort Kent, Maine, and I have the northernmost bookstore in the eastern United States. So when we have events, it's a really big deal because a lot of authors won't travel this far. So thanks, Mike, for joining us. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on your work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I'm happy for the opportunity. And Heidi's bookstore really is great. So if you have the opportunity to travel up, or if you want to order books, let her know.
Yes,
it's a great little store, great little town up there. Yeah, so I am a former National Park ranger. I worked actually at several different national parks, although most of my experience is at Katmai in Alaska. I left that position though in the spring of 2016. I spent a summer working at North Cascades National Park, but then recently, just a few years ago, I was offered the opportunity to start to work with the brown bears at Katmai National Park again, in a kind of a similar role I had as a park ranger up there, but working through the webcams and helping to talk about the bears and the salmon and help people understand the experience of watching the bears through the webcams and understand the lives of those animals. So at the beginning of my park ranger career, I never would have quite imagined, working primarily on the internet. So my career has taken a different path, but it's worthwhile and it's very fulfilling because I have the opportunity now through the webcams and through my book to share the experience and the specialness and the uniqueness of Katmai with people all over the world. And that's something that I couldn't have envisioned back when I first started working as a ranger.
well, it's clear from all of the people that have signed on tonight that you have an interest base all over the United States, certainly. And it's really nice to see that. And I got to tell you, I've been suckered into those webcams watching those bears fish, and I just can't get enough of it. It's like I cheer whenever they catch a fish, like anybody can hear me, but it's a pretty neat experience, and it's I think a gift to those of us that can't travel to Alaska to be able to still have that experience. I really want to make sure that everybody that's joining us through Zoom, and some of our Facebook Live listeners might not realize this, but we do have a Zoom audience as well. But our Zoom audience, please, if you have questions for Mike, please put them in the chat. We'd love to be able to answer some of your questions tonight as well. So you said that the primary amount of your work was at Katmai. What brought you to Alaska in the first place? Was it the bears themselves, or was it something else?
Well, it was something else. I don't have actually like a really great origin story like you might find in with some other park rangers. you'll talk to them and they'll say, you know what, I read about this park as a kid and I wanted to work there, and that was the only, and that's, now I'm living the dream. I was early in my career very interested in hopping from park to park to park, because I wanted to experience a lot of different places. Um, but in 2006, I worked as a ranger at Acadia, and I was planning on going back there the next summer, but I was in Death Valley. So I was in Death Valley the winter of 2006, 2007. And then my girlfriend, uh, she at the time was like, you know what, I applied to this place in Alaska called Katmai, and they're offering me a job. So I think I'm going to go. And I was like, okay, let's see if I can, I can ride your coattails, so to speak. So they actually had a volunteer opportunity for me available that summer. So
Wow.
I said, you know, thanks Acadia, but I'm going to this different place. So we ended up going to Katmai, and I was very excited to go there because I had not really had the chance to experience wild Alaska before. I had been to like a lot of national parks in the lower 48, like in working like at Death Valley, for instance, which is a very wild space, but it's also cherry stemmed with a lot of roads.
Mm.
So when I went to Alaska, I was really excited to experience a roadless landscape, and then also experience the volcanoes there. That was something that really kind of piqued my interest initially. I didn't envision falling in love with the bears like I did, but that happened really quickly. As soon as the bears started to show up at the river and I started to learn about their individual lives, I was hooked. It really only took me, you know, a few days before I wanted to know more and more and more about how these animals were making a living.
Oh, it's amazing to watch for sure. And in the book, it was, so first of all, I'm a bookseller, so I gotta talk about your book a little bit. Is that I love the way that it's written because it's in three parts. So in the beginning, we learn the origin story, so to speak, of the national park itself. And it's still a young space because of those volcanoes, right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, but the parts of Katmai are just over 100 years old in a sense, like the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. That's a landscape that was created in 1912 during the eruption of Nova Rupta volcano. So, and that's a unique landscape on the face of the earth. I mean, it really is an incredible place to explore. If you have that opportunity to go to Katmai and go to Brooks Camp to see the bears, if you can spare a day to at least go out to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, I think it's certainly worth seeing. So it's a very geologically active place. Like the mountains and the rocks behind me are, you know, 400 years old, and they've been sculpted by glaciers. So the shape of the landscape has changed over time, but this is more of a more solid ground, so to speak, than what you find in parts of Alaska. So yeah, that was something that really piqued my interest at first. This is volcanoes,
Yeah.
and then the story of the park.
Yeah, I thought that was a great way to lead in. I appreciated that in the book too, is how to get to understand how that park came to be. And then you talk about the bears and their life cycle. And it was really interesting to me. And I think I shared this with you earlier. It's very experiential because it's like these little, oh, I had the word and it just left me, but snippets of, oh, vignettes. That's what I was going to say. Vignettes of these bears' lives and how that helps tell the story of the science, but in a very entertaining way. You were talking about a time one of them got very aggressive towards his family, and I was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen here? And it's not, when you go to read a book that is nature based, you don't always feel like you're going to have these kind of suspenseful moments, but you certainly do through this book, and I love that. And then the third part is about humans and the impact there. So I do want to talk about that as well. But for those of you that haven't had a chance to read the book or are not familiar with the webcam situation, I just want to explain something, is that Mike is here in Maine, but he manages the webcams that are observing these bears all the time for people to watch across the world. And that's a very important thing that I just want to impress. I know we've said it in different ways, but I just want to be very clear about that. 2020 has shown us how technology can do these kinds of events where you're over here, you're over there, and I'm over here, and it's working out pretty good. But it's also amazing to know that you can be a whole country away, really, and get to do the work that you're doing. Are there ever any problems with the webcams in filming the bears?
There can be problems with with the power system up there if there's not enough sunlight, for example. And we had a little bit of an issue with that earlier this year. But there's some technicians from Explore.org are going to head up there in early August to try to give the power system a boost. So maybe by installing, I think a wind turbine, a small scale wind turbine, something that maybe is only, not very big. So not like what you would see on a mountaintop or anything like that, but just enough that when it's cloudy, often the wind is still blowing. So we'd still be able to generate some power and keep the system running. So yeah, there's things like that. The wintertime up there can be really harsh on the equipment. There's been years where the wind has blown over radio repeaters there or destroyed previous wind turbines. It gets covered with hoarfrost and rime ice as well. So when those things happen, you kind of just have to shrug your shoulders and be like, well, we tried our best.
Yeah.
It's a challenging landscape to keep these things going.
Short of getting on a plane and traveling for a few days, right?
Right.
But you do have this support system from Explore.org that takes care of those things.
Yeah, I'm part of a small yet very dedicated team that keeps the webcams running, and we have webcams not only on brown bears at Katmai, but in many places around the world. And some of my other favorites happen to be like the cameras that we have in Africa, so you can watch things like giraffes and lions and elephants, coming down to a watering hole. We have some underwater cameras, which are really relaxing, and I like to see those too. If I'm just looking, if I'm working and I just want something kind of in the background of, a computer monitor to, just to see, just like looking at an aquarium, we have stuff like that as well.
I did check some of those out, and I would agree with you. They are very relaxing. That's pretty cool. So in these vignettes, we meet several bears that you tend to, some of them have names, some of them have numbers. And I'm curious as to how that happens, why they're numbered, first of all, and how does some of them end up with names and some of them just have their number?
There's a long-term bear monitoring study at Brooks River, in the current sort of iteration of it started in 2001. And what happens during that study is that there's a person who's called the bear monitor, essentially. So her job is to sit along the river during monitoring sessions and record every bear that comes down. So she's recording the location. She takes information about maybe how they're fishing, and notes other behaviors, but importantly, she notes the identities of the bears. She notes their physical and behavioral characteristics, takes photographs of those bears, and then compares those photographs with previous years. And if it's a new bear, they're assigned an identification number. If it's a bear that we've seen before, then that bear gets its old number, for instance. So like a lot of the bears that I write about in the book aren't new to the river. They have been coming back to the river for most of their lives. And so they're all assigned numbers through that process, as long as they're seen in the monitoring sessions. But not all of them get nicknames. The nicknames kind of come about organically. There's really no, I guess, set process to nickname a bear. And in the past, a lot of the rangers were giving more bears nicknames, like Otis, for example, or Holly. And the current sort of crop of rangers at the river are shying away from that. They're kind of de-emphasizing nicknames, thinking that maybe it's too humanizing or too anthropomorphic to give a bear a nickname. And I disagree with them on that, and that's fine. Because we can recognize, they can have a name, and we can recognize still at the same time that they're wild animals. But yeah, sometimes they get nicknames just because of the way they behave or the way they look, for instance. Maybe the best example of that is a bear who we don't see at the river anymore, but he was nicknamed Ted, and his nickname was really just a memory reminder for the people who were identifying him, because Ted is short for triangle eared. His ears were very triangle shaped. And that was just one of those things that helped people remember who they were looking at. So sometimes they come about through that. Sometimes it can describe other physical features. There's a bear that we see on the cameras this summer who was nicknamed a long time ago Popeye. And he just had, when he was a younger bear, really furry forearms. It just looked like he had really big forearms. So that's kind of how he got his nickname. And then there's a bear that we just caught a glimpse of a couple of times this summer, who does feature in the book, I think in the hunger chapter, and he's nicknamed Lefty because he has a short left ear. So that's kind of an easy way to remember him.
Well, I found it fascinating because through your descriptions in the book, and plus having that additional experience of watching some of the videos that you've also created, like you have one, Meet Otis. It's like you really get to see their personalities and how they have these really interesting characteristics that define who they are as a being, and I love that. And I'm with you. I like the nicknames. I think that's pretty cool. I see a question in the chat pertaining to Otis. You mentioned Otis already, so I want to bring that up. It says, Mike, what do you think of Otis's very late return this year? Were you starting to get worried that he might not return?
Yeah, to give everyone a little bit of background on Otis, probably most of the people watching know a little bit about Otis, but in case you don't, Otis is maybe the oldest adult male that we know of at Brooks River right now. There are some that are similar in age, so we're not sure if he is the oldest, but he could be. So, but we're pretty sure, we're pretty confident he's around 26 years old, which is fairly old for a wild brown bear. And he's used the river every year of his adult life since he was identified in 2001. So when he hadn't shown up this July, yeah, I think a lot of people were justifiably concerned, like whether he had passed away or something like that, because he had never taken so long to get to the river. But we don't know why he took so long. He showed up not that long ago, just a few days ago, to much rejoicing for a lot of Otis fans out there. And I was wondering whether he was going to come back, to be honest with everybody. And if he didn't come back to the river, since he had been so consistent in returning to this place to fish and make a living through the last 20 years, I was if he hadn't come back, it was probably more likely than not that he was deceased. But he showed once again that he's a survivor. He can persevere. He's a resilient bear, even in his old age. So yeah, I think a lot of people are enjoying having him back.
I'm sure. I've even enjoyed seeing him a few times myself on some of those videos. It's he's pretty laid back, and he has his own way about him that is it's hard not to get fond of him. I think you had written in the book that he had caught 47 fish in one afternoon fishing. Was that?
Yeah, the exact number, I'm trying to remember, maybe around 40 or so. It was a lot.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the capacity of their stomach is incredible. And that was something that really, when I started counting that evening, I thought I would see Otis eating like 15 or 20 fish and be like, oh, okay, yeah, so he's hungry. But 40 fish, I mean, it just kept on going and going and going. And I was really quite amazed. And that was over maybe about 5.5 hours or so. He was taking in literally like hundreds of thousands of calories in that sitting. So yeah, he could pack them down when there's a lot of fish and he's hungry.
And roughly how big is a sockeye salmon, an average size?
About 4 to 8 pounds on average, although they've been trending smaller in recent years. That's something that might have a little bit to do with the changing climate. It seems like the conditions that favor survival for those fish are really good early in their lives, so they grow a lot faster, but maybe they're not spending as much time in the ocean, and that's really where they gain most of their body mass. But yeah, around 4 to 8 pounds. And for each one of those fish, on average, if it's coming back to the river, it's fresh from the ocean, it contains probably about 4,500 calories of digestible energy.
That's amazing.
So if Otis is eating a whole fish, I mean, if he eats 2 of them, he's taking in 9,000 calories. And if he takes in 40 fish, I mean, again, hundreds of thousands.
That's amazing. That's not on my point system for Weight Watchers. Okay, let me see. I want to see. Oh, we had another question pertaining to the delay in Otis coming back, and this is from Tina. How many times do the bears have to be missing before they are assumed not coming back to Brooks Falls?
Well, I think it might depend on the bear, its age. For example, like bears like Otis, who have been so regular in their habits. You know, if they don't, if a bear like Otis doesn't come back, then it's, I think, more likely than not, then it's probably deceased. But there are a lot of bears that don't come back to the river each year for whatever reason. They decide, you know, well, one year I want to hang out here, and then another year I'm going to go someplace else. Lefty's a good example of that. I mean, he was never seen fishing at Brooks Falls until 2015. And then he decided, well, I'm going to come back and I'm going to use Brooks Falls for several more years. Prior to that, we'd only really seen him in September and October, scavenging for salmon. He really never came during the migration period for the salmon. So he changed his habits, but this year, maybe he's gone back to his old ways. And he came down, he looked at the river for a little bit, and then he left. So he's probably making a living somewhere else. So with some of those other bears, you can't quite be sure. It's really with the bears that we see regularly year after year after year, that if they don't come back, then it's maybe more likely than not that they're deceased. The trouble is that, you know, often we don't have closure on those situations because they, you know, the bears just wander off into the forest. And the Katmai is a large park. I mean, it's about 4 million acres in size. So it's bigger than Yellowstone and Yosemite combined in size. So, and it's extremely rare to find a dead bear across that landscape. So most of the time we really just don't know if a bear found another place to make a living, or if it actually is dead.
So two of my children have had the unique experience of going with biologists into the woods in the winter time and checking on the dens of hibernating black bears.
Oh, fascinating.
And then, of course, we have these great pictures of them holding these tiny little bears in their arms, you know, which looks so endearing. And I'm so glad we have those pictures. But one of the questions I had when I was reading the book is that it seems to be a common thing that we're monitoring our black bears by tagging them and following them. Is that not a common practice with the brown bears?
It's probably less common with brown bears in Katmai than what might happen in parts of the lower 48 states, because like brown bears are in Katmai are more conspicuous, for example. So it's, you know, if you want to see them, just park yourself along a salmon stream, like go to Brooks River, stand on the wildlife viewing platforms, and you'll see them. So you can learn a lot just by watching them. But, you know, there are in this forest environment, like behind me, there are black bears in the forest here, and I see signs of them once in a while, like a marking tree or some tracks every once in a while, maybe a pile of scat. But those are just like the tiniest snapshots of their actual existence in the forest. So it's much, I think, harder to gain an understanding of what those bears are doing in certain areas of North America without putting like like tags on them or radio collars, that sort of thing. Although those studies have been done in Katmai in the past, but there's no studies like that right now. It really may depend on how strongly you know, the people who manage, you know, these different populations need that information, for example.
Mm. Do you feel like the changing climate will steer things in that direction where they'll have to do that for their own to understand how to better protect them? Or
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure about the bears at Brooks River necessarily, but a few years ago on the Pacific coast of the park, there was a fairly large scale tracking study to kind of get like some baseline information on how bears utilized marine food sources like clams and sedges and salt marshes and things like that. And I can foresee like that set of information serving as a baseline, and then in 20 or 30 or 40 years, if they are able to you know, put GPS collars on more bears, then we can compare and contrast. So those are also like kind of really important reference points to compare for. But at Brooks River, there's actually very little information that we about the bears when they're not away from, or when they're not at the river. Like we know a lot about what they're doing, how they use the river when they're fishing there, and how they're competing for those fishing spots. But when they wander off into the forest, we can only make generalizations about those specific animals because we have very little information about where they go otherwise.
That's interesting. So I want to just divert our conversation quickly for a minute. We'll come back to the bears, but I'm interested
Sure.
to know about you as a writer, as an author. Is this something that you had thought of doing before, that you've enjoyed writing, or that you might have wanted to be a writer at some point in your life prior to this experience?
Not at this level. In college, I remember taking an English class once and writing an essay that the professor seemed to really like. So that was encouraging. But I didn't consider myself really like a great writer. But I had some opportunities here and there working at different national parks to update some brochures and things like that. And then also speaking with the public and thinking about the ways to most accurately communicate important messages in a succinct manner. So people got the message, it was clear to them, they could understand it very easily. I did toy with the idea of writing like a bicycling guide to Death Valley when I was working there, but I had no idea really kind of how to do it. It was fun for me to ride all the roads and everything and take notes on that, but it never really went anywhere. But when I went to Katmai, and I spent a few years there, I started to notice how complicated the story was, and also how fascinating it was too. And then the webcams became a reality, and then I realized, hey, well, there's an audience for
Yeah.
this story, and then I kind of got hooked on that idea, and it took me many years to actually finish the book itself. I'm a slow writer. It helped me that I eventually had a deadline, but yeah, it was a long process to kind of come to this point.
Well, as I've already said, I just feel that it was just so beautifully written. And for somebody that enjoys nature like I do, I found there were passages that just sucked me right in, where I knew exactly the kind of feeling you may have been experiencing at that moment. And I really appreciated that an awful lot. It was really nice to be able, it's soothing reading for me. I
Thanks
enjoyed
so much.
that.
I really enjoy books kind of like that, I guess, and that
Oh,
was what I was trying
I
to
was
emulate.
going to ask you, like, who's influenced you like, what do you like to read?
I love natural history books, so I will read those as much as I can. I have been known to pick up a textbook just for information and read that straight through if I'm really kind of diving into a subject itself. But yeah, those like natural history narration books. The main author that I can think of is who I love is Bernd Heinrich.
Mm,
So I've read most of his. I don't know if I've gotten through all of his books, but most of his books. I found Rachel Carson's writing also very influential over time. Aldo Leopold as well. When I think about like early conservationists, I mean Aldo Leopold. If you haven't read Sand County Almanac, the way he writes is just. I mean, he can pack in so much in so little words. I mean, and that to me is kind of like an inspiration looking at those things. But yeah, I really enjoy reading books that pair kind of like science with personal experience, and that's what I tried to
exactly
emulate
what
in
you
the book.
did. It was amazing. The other thing that struck me on a note of literature is just how much, and I'm doing this because what I'm looking at is the list of research that Mike put into this. We know you've experienced Brooks River, but talk a little bit about your research. There's also something that you had shared with me about your notebooks, and I'd like you to share that with everybody as well.
Yeah, the research process was kind of extensive for this. When I first started writing the book, I thought I kind of had most of it finished, just because that was part of my general job as a ranger or working for Explore.org, making sure that I had as many of my facts straight, and I could, if someone was asking me for a source, I knew where that was. But then when I started to write the book, I found out that I actually didn't have all of my sources lined up as well as I did. And it took me sometimes a long time to track down specific facts. Like when I mentioned before the 4,500 calories in a sockeye salmon for a brown bear, it was like, well, where did that actually come from? So I had to, track those things down, and it took sometimes a long while to get to those sources. And then you get down into a rabbit hole as well of research where you're reading like a paper and you look at the citations and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to go to that paper, then that paper, and then that paper. And it really kind of never ends. Thankfully, thankfully with some topics, uh, there was a limit to how much I could read about it. Like with bear hibernation, people really only started researching that in the 1970s. So like the scientific literature kind of like stops associated with bear hibernation at that point. Before that, it's all mostly just speculation. People are like, oh yeah, bears went to sleep. How they do it, we don't really know. So there was that process. And then also, yeah, the observational process, which I enjoyed, in reading, again, books by like people like Bernheidrich, for example, and also meeting some really great naturalists in my life. They were, helped me understand that it's important to kind of write down things so you can remember them, because things blur from year to year. So yeah, I have, again, my trusty Write in the Rain notebook with me here. And this is something that I like to take with me to Katmai. When I go out to my sit spot here in the forest, I take that with me as well, just so I can keep track of what the plants and the animals are doing, or thoughts that I might have that could be relevant in the future. Yeah, so I love to, just write in the book. It's probably pretty hard to see
Oh yeah, it is.
any of that stuff, but yeah, that's
Tiny.
scribbling down notes is extremely helpful as part of that like research and writing process.
It's fascinating. I've often felt that way as a mother, because there's things my kids would do and I would always say to myself, I have to write that down. And I didn't always get to it. And then just a week or two would go by and I had just wanted to, get mad at myself, because it's amazing. You think you're going to remember, but having those notes, I'm sure, was really helpful. And what a gift at some point in your life, you have all these notebooks to show what you've been doing all this time.
Hopefully someone will want them.
I
I'll
bet they
keep them
will.
around as much as I
Some
can.
will, for sure. So what else did I want to talk about? The one story that you wrote about in the book that really kind of got me. I was nervous. I was like, oh, that's so sweet. Then I was nervous. You were talking about infanticide, and I don't want to bring our conversation to this deep, dark place, but essentially what happened is one of the male bears ended up going after a cub, and you were right there in the thick of it, which I can't even imagine. But you said something in writing that passage about staying emotionally detached. And that kind of struck me. Like, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could stay emotionally detached in those situations. Do you find that difficult at all?
Sometimes, yeah. In a situation like that, I think, you're a lot of those emotional instincts that we have inside of us bleeds out no matter how hard you try. And I was on a wildlife viewing platform. I'm separated from the bears. It wouldn't have been safe for me to intervene, even if it was appropriate to do so. So yeah, I mean, you feel a little bit helpless. You feel empathy for the cub in that situation, the mother too, and it's also, a feeling of confusion, because that's a behavior in bears that is not fully understood.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, those I do feel, emotion when I'm watching the bears, even though I try to remove myself from, I try to put up a wall, but as a human being with emotions, there's only so much I can do. As much as I try to emulate Spock in those situations and just be like, well, no, that's just the way it is, Jim, and
Yeah. So
quick and
that's that.
rational. So,
Do you have a favorite bear?
it's I have a lot of bears that I like to watch. I don't know if I could say I have a favorite. There's a bear that I really miss watching, and I write about her in the book too, number 410. We don't see her at the river anymore. She was one of those really old bears. She was like 27, 28, 29, or somewhere in there when she was last observed. She was such a great bear to
Hmm.
um, to to see, because she was kind of unique in that she was so habituated to the presence of people that she would utilize the areas like near the lodge and the cabins and the bridge frequently. So we got to know her really well in that sense. She was just always kind of around. Her adaptability in those situations was fascinating to see. And she was, yeah, she was just a great bear to have around. And she created a lot of management challenges because sometimes she would sleep on the trails or very close to the trails, or she would be like right next to the bridge, and people couldn't get to where they wanted to go. So you had to be patient with her. But yeah, she was a really great bear to have around. And I kind of miss uh, not having her at Brooks River. It's almost like the river's not the same place
Oh,
without 410, because she was always sort of like a part of that experience when I was there as a ranger.
does she have a nickname?
No, she's been called kind of different things over the years. So maybe people tried to give her a nickname. There, some people tried to call her 410, or excuse me, 4 ton for a little bit because she got really, really big in the fall. But that nickname never really stuck. It seemed or stuck. It seemed like when I was there, people were just calling her number 410. And that's one of those numbers that I can't actually imagine calling her anything else but 410.
So talk a little bit about the salmon and how we talked about them already a little bit, but I'm more interested to know like how it's important to take care of them so that they continue to take care of the bears. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the salmon are they're like the keystone, the bedrock of the ecosystem up there, and really most of the experiences that people want in Katmai. Like if you want to watch bears gathering at a waterfall or anywhere to fish for salmon, you got to have the fish there, or the bears are going to be dispersed across the landscape. So it's much harder to view, brown bears without, a concentrated food source. And salmon provide that. They also support the high densities of bears in that habitat. Katmai has, at last estimate, more than 2,000 brown bears living either wholly or partly within its boundaries. So
Mm.
it's one of the densest populations of brown bears anywhere in the world. And that is largely a product of abundant salmon runs, especially in the center part of Katmai where Brooks River is. In that place, there's not a lot of really rich food resources other than berries, but berries don't come into season until late summer, for example. So without salmon, the bears in those habitats would be living in much lower densities, and they'd be probably smaller bodied overall because it's a lot harder to grow big on when you're eating mostly berries and other vegetation. And if you want to go to Katmai to fish for like rainbow trout, for example, I mean, the rainbow trout there are immense. Some of them are 30 inches long, and they're not
Wow.
stocked or anything like that. So, here, if we get a 10-inch brookie in some of the streams around here, people kind of get excited
Yeah,
about
they do.
that. but but yeah, 30-inch rainbow trout up there that are they're getting fat on salmon, salmon fry, salmon eggs, and so the salmon support sort of like that tourist economy. They support um, the sustainable fishery in Bristol Bay, which is managed very well. And right now, I mean, the salmon runs up there are just gangbusters. I really do think they can. Hopefully, they serve as an inspiration for other places that are struggling to sort of restore their salmon runs, like here in Maine too. And I know there's been a ton of work done in the Penobscot to bring salmon back into much of that watershed, but there's still a long, long way to go. Same thing with the Kennebec too, and a lot of controversy associated with that. But Bristol Bay is like one of these kind of bright points. I think in the world right now, when there's just so much kind of bad news about the state
Mm,
of the environment and our climate.
that's I would it's not surprising because we're seeing it everywhere, right? But it's also very sad that that's an issue everywhere too. Um, I was surprised. I didn't realize that the trout were eating the I don't know the appropriate names. Fry, you call it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the juvenile salmon when they're in fresh water, yeah, I mean, when they're small, they're generally called fry or fingerlings. Sometimes you'll hear them.
And that surprised me. That was something I learned in reading this book too, is I didn't realize that whole thing. So you did say briefly about humans fishing for those salmon. Does that compete at all with what the bears have to fish from?
It could if the people in the fishery out in Bristol Bay were taking too many fish, but the state of Alaska is very, very careful about managing the number of fish that go up into each one of these like major drainages. So like the Nushagak, for instance, the Queechak, the Alagnak, the Naknek, which Brooks River is a part of, and then a few other rivers as well. So they have individual, what is called escapement goals for those streams. And they make sure that they close the fishery to allow enough, periodically, to allow enough fish to go up into those drainages to sustain the run. And I think they also will, and I don't know how they do it, but they calculate in, what maybe the bears need, for instance, or other wildlife. So they're in their math, they're like, well, we're going to lose a certain percentage of the fish to the predators who are seeking these fish. So we need to maybe let a few more in there. And that's kind of, again, kind of a bright spot when you think of the state of wild fisheries across North America. I mean, the cod fishery in like the Gulf of Maine and the North Atlantic collapsed, a long time ago, and it's unclear whether that's going to recover. The salmon populations in much of the lower 48 states, including parts of the Northeast US, and then and also out west too. With migration barriers like dams and things like that, warming water temperatures. I mean, the fish are really kind of getting hammered in a lot of spots, and it'll be difficult to recover those populations. But I think we kind of owe it to future generations to give it a shot. And Bristol Bay offers, again, that sort of like shining example of what can be if we protect salmon fisheries and manage them as well.
So how about how many people a year on a normal year? Let's not count 2020 as a normal year, but normally how many people visit Brooks River on an annual basis?
It's been growing since probably about 2010 or so. Before that, it averaged, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 people a year, but it's been slowly creeping up. And then in 2019, it was more than 14,000 people, and it's probably going to be that this summer too. It's probably going to reach those levels, if not be slightly higher. And while that might not seem a lot, Brooks River is only 1.5 miles long. So when you have dozens of brown bears interacting with several hundred people a day, that really does present a potential for conflict, and especially over space. When you're at Brooks River, you're not allowed to carry food around with you. So there's very little risk that a bear is going to start to associate people with food, because we've sort of removed that temptation. But we're still in like that habitat, for example. So that's one of the things that I'm concerned about, not only Brooks River, but other national parks as well. A lot of other national parks, I mean, people they want to experience those spaces, and I encourage people to go there, but there's only so much room in a lot of these parks. So I think that's an issue that we're grappling with right now, and I'm not really sure what the solution might be.
It's interesting. Well, we've been doing this here I could talk about this for a long time. It's so interesting. Let me just see if we have any more questions that I could. A question. Is your wife still a park ranger?
She is, yes. Yeah, she is.
I'm not sure. This one says, do bears dig a new den every winter or reuse the old ones?
In Katmai, they're probably going to dig a new den each year. They generally go to steep slopes that are well vegetated, so like alder thickets and things like that, willow thickets, and in places though that hold a lot of snow. So the vegetation probably helps to support the structure of the den itself with all the roots, and the snow helps to insulate the den. So they get a big thick blanket of snow, but it's maybe not like what you might find in parts of Eastern North America with black bears, where a black bear might have like like underneath a tree or something like that, and it'll go back there repeatedly. The dens in Katmai, the soils probably just don't support the den surviving through the summer, so they usually collapse. But bears seem to show in Katmai some fidelity towards their denning areas, so they're probably going back to like the same general area of a mountainside, for instance, to dig a den.
Someone asked, how many of those small yellow books have you filled up by now?
Well, I try to be very economical in the way I write, so not too many. I probably have like, I don't know, 7 or so. But last time I checked, and I don't know if it's still true, but Write in the Rain had discontinued the style of notebook because the pages are blank. I don't want to be hindered by lines, even though I'm writing in straight lines. So I ended up finding like another seller who had a stockpile of them, and I bought 10 of them just in case.
Yeah, it's always nice when you have that favorite thing. Oh, do the bears eat rainbow trout also?
Occasionally, it's not one of their preferred food resources for a couple of different reasons. I think one is that they're just really conditioned to catch salmon, and they maybe prefer the flavor of salmon. We'll sometimes see a bear catch a rainbow trout, maybe on purpose or by accident, and it's almost like they bite into it and they're like, "What is this? This is not what I was expecting." So it's kind of a weird thing and interesting to observe. It definitely seems like they notice, like immediately, like, "Hey, this isn't a salmon." Um, so the trout are smaller. They probably don't contain as many fats in them as a migrating sockeye salmon. Then also they exist at lower densities. So they're not migrating and spawning in like really super high densities where it would be easy for a bear to catch them. So they'll take that opportunity when it's presented to himself, but it doesn't happen very often.
Interesting. So, another question about the dens. How far from the river do they go typically to den?
That is also kind of like a personal preference with the bears. They'll go to the surrounding mountains though in general. So like Dumpling Mountain, which is very close, um, and I talk about an experience I had on Dumpling Mountain um, in the book about with the bear, um, and then also they'll go to like the other mountains in the near vicinity. Some of them you can see on like the webcams that show the lower river area of Brooks River. In the 1970s, though, Heidi, to get back to kind of one of your previous questions about tracking, there was a biologist who installed radio collars on a few of the bears using Brooks River in the fall, and he found one of the bears moved 40 miles away, probably denned in an area about 40 miles away from Brooks River. So some of them can travel quite far, but I suspect that most of them aren't going that far.
Interesting. Okay. There's a woman that works at a library, and she says, I work at a library and we have Mike's book on the shelf and watch the bears on Saturdays on explore.org. Thanks for doing this.
Oh,
That's
wonderful.
nice. Um, okay. Oh, very good question. In theory, if the salmon were gone, could the bears make up the calories with berries and vegetation?
Some of them could, some of them wouldn't. It's harder. It would be pretty hard on the moms with cubs because they're, first of all the bears in Katmai, the adult bears are pretty big overall. So the bigger you are, the more calories you need, and it's harder to make a living on vegetation. Although some bears are able to do that. There are some vegetation sources like in early summer on the Pacific coast of the park where bears can graze on sedge like a cow grazing on grass. It's a pretty fascinating thing to see, and that sedge is actually really high in protein when it starts to grow. So that'll help some bears gain weight even before the salmon arrive. And there's a bunch of other food resources on the coast of the park, and I think the bears on the coast would do better than the bears in the interior, where there's maybe less or fewer options for food. But a young bear, yeah, that excuse me, it would have to learn how to find a lot of those other food resources, but some of them would, but the density of the population would not be the same over excuse me for 1 second.
Yes.
Let me grab a drink of water here.
We've had you talking like crazy, so I'm not surprised.
I'll I'll avoid gargling
Yeah.
for a second, but I mean maybe
We've had too many questions for Mike, I guess.
no, that should do it. So thanks for being patient with that.
Not a problem.
Yeah, but over
go ahead.
time, the density of the population of bears would significantly decline, and we would see densities more akin to what you might find at Denali National Park in the center of Alaska, where Denali is a bigger park than Katmai, but it only has about 600 bears. or so in it.
Oh
So,
my gosh.
so that tells you how important like salmon are and other those really rich food resources are to these bears.
I guess. My God. Um, did you have some photos to share with us? Did we ever get to the bottom of that or no?
We didn't. I have a few on my desktop, but I didn't particularly identify
Oh, okay.
um, any. I can see. I can bring one up here. Um, there was and again,
Did-
if my internet cuts
Goes.
out on me, then you'll know why if I try to share my screen here. So trying to see if there's well, I think I've shown this before. This is actually a video. I showed this I think on one of our bear cam chats, but I mean it's probably worth showing again because it's just one of those bears that's older. She's at the river frequently um, when she has cubs, and she's one of those bears that is fairly tolerant of people. So when we're thinking about the individual bears at the river, I find it fascinating to see how the bears are how some of them tolerate the presence of people and are able to adapt to those circumstances, and others, for whatever reason, it's just kind of maybe in their instincts or their genes, or maybe they had a bad experience with people when they were younger. They're just a little bit kind of weirded out by crowds. But a lot of the mother bears with cubs, especially, seem to be able to find more habitat if they tolerate the presence of people, because a lot of the big males, for whatever reason, don't like to be near crowds of people. So let me try to share this video of number. Oh, it says it's the host is disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, the host needs to get on the
Yeah.
ball.
So, but to
wonder
set this up for everybody, this is number 482 Brett and her two cubs swimming near Brooks River, or in Brooks River. You'll see a crowd of people nearby. And when people are watching the webcams and they're reading the book, yeah, I definitely want people to consider, how different bears are adapting to these situations, because each one of these bears is a unique individual, and that was one thing that makes the wildlife watching experience at the river, I think, unique and fascinating in a sense.
Let me see here if I can. It doesn't look like it might be something that I inadvertently clicked when I was setting up this event. So I am so sorry about that, because that would have been nice.
But that's no problem. I think if people are looking for that
Yeah.
video, you can look for the replay of the live chat we did maybe last week or the week before about the resiliency in bears. So, and you can find that on explore.org's YouTube channel, one of the YouTube channels for that. I don't have the exact link, but
I found that when I looked up Bears of Brooks Falls on YouTube, they came right up. So hopefully that would be the case for anybody that's interested in seeing those videos. And I do, if you haven't already watched the webcams, the live webcams, or watch some of the videos that Mike has made about the specific bears, I highly recommend you do that, because it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to watch. The book is fascinating, The Bears of Brooks Falls. At Bogan Books, I'm going to put it again. I put it already in the chat early on. I'm going to copy it right now and paste it down at the bottom. If you don't have a copy of Mike's book and you want to buy one, I just put the link in the chat to purchase one from Bogan Books, and we have some signed book plates that Mike has generously sent us. So you'd have a signed copy of the book, and we do ship everywhere. So just look on our website for that information. I would have so many more questions for you, Mike, but I feel like we've been on for a little while. I want to encourage people to visit your website. Do you want to give them the address for that?
Well, the most important website is explore.org/bears to go watch those. And then if you want to kind of keep up on some of the things I've been writing about, um, check out fitznaturalist.com. And my last name is spelled Fitz. So you can find that, or just search Mike Fitz and Katmai or bears, and you'll probably be able to find it through that too. One of the posts that I want to write is about the Crystal Bog, or the 1,000-acre bog, which is just south of Patton.
Oh, yes.
It's maybe the most spectacular bog I've ever been to, and I love it. I love exploring bogs. It's one of I actually made a point to write about bogs in the book, but it's incredible. It's one of those landscapes in Maine, one of the few landscapes that probably a Wabanaki person from, let's say, like the 16th or even the 15th century would recognize. The rest of the state has been modified by humanity quite a bit, even though it's still a highly forested state. But yeah, that's an amazing spot. It's hard to get into, but I'm really looking forward to kind of sharing a little bit of my experiences with everybody about that.
Oh, I'll have to check on that for sure. We were just talking about that as a family because recently a family member had visited a bog, so I'll definitely look for that myself. Thanks for letting me know. We have talked also about doing another event in September, so I'm calling you out right here in front of God and everybody. So hopefully we'll get to do that again.
Sounds great.
And we had talked, I think at first about doing it in person, but this has worked out really nice too, because we're getting to interact with people all over the country, which was really a special treat for us. Do you have anything else you want to share about your book or the work that you're doing before we go?
I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I know, managing everything, managing the chat, managing the questions, setting this stuff up is complicated and sometimes stressful. So you did a great job tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For that. And yeah, again, if anyone has the opportunity to go up to Fort Kent, stop in the bookstore. I was able to find a book in there that I was looking for and I hadn't been able to find elsewhere. So looking for, a big Birds of Maine, sort of like an encyclopedic tome. And I found it there. So, you never know what you're going to discover inside of these great bookshops. So yeah, head up to Heidi's place and say hello. But yeah, I encourage everyone to continue to watch the webcams on explore.org. You can contact me through my website if you want to, if you have additional questions. Or you can find me on explore.org frequently to ask me questions there. I'll be happy to try to answer those. I'm fortunate to be able to share this experience with everybody, and I encourage people to continue to watch the bears. There's going to be a lot of great bear watching through October.
This is awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for spending so much time with us and for all that you're doing. I think it's awesome.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And to everybody that joined us, thank you for joining in. And we're going to say goodnight for now, but hopefully if you're interested in the bears, to make sure you keep watching them and interact with Mike as you can with the webcams, and read the book, because it's fun to watch the bears, but Mike really does have a wonderful way with words. And if you enjoy nature, it's a really wonderful read. So anyway, thank you, everyone. I'm going to end this right now. It's going to end abruptly, Mike. So
all right. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.